The modern briefing thing, by implication, kind of suggests that we might have kind of hit an outdated process, and therefore we kind of are thinking. And by listening to the brilliant minds that have gone before me, I kind of get this sense of kind of what you really want is what's the views of what's a good and bad process. And I'm a bit worried by anybody that says kind of something's broken, because mostly it's not. It's kind of, most things are kind of fine, but they can, it's that marginal thing about getting to the end of an opportunity and making sure you truly understand it. And it's kind of, not everything's broken. The media love to tell you everything's broken. The fact is, it's because the media industry is mostly broken and it sells newspapers. And it's in that permanent crisis, post-crisis, crisis thing that sometimes I worry that we're kind of approaching it in the wrong way. And I don't get that sense here, so that's fine. What I get the sense of is that the briefing process, and my understanding of it, and I have been distracted for the last 4 or 5 years on the Olympics and Paralympics, and in truth, I kind of missed out reading lots of stuff and seeing what was going on in the industry, so I'm learning, resurfacing, if you like the Mary Rose, but just not as old. But what I get the sense of, as a discipline, kind of we're always thinking about can we improve, and in this sense I think it's brilliant. I love this thing about briefing from within inside the business. You know, Joanna Bamford, who taught me a lot about planning when she was at Lowe and other places, she used to come in on a Monday morning, I'd get a phone call about 8 o'clock and she'd go, how many pallets did we shift over the weekend? And it was a brilliant question, because by about 7:30 on a Monday morning, I would be getting it somewhere difficult if we hadn't sold enough pallets and distributed them over the weekend. Back to classic product management and owning your brand. I think sometimes, though, if we're trying to change things, if we're trying to adapt too much, we might fail, because I think all too often change, and radical change, is an overstated and overcomplicated concept. It's easy to talk about change. It's easy to say, we're going to change everything. We're going to change the planning process. Truth is, it doesn't work that way. And there's not many people that do it brilliantly. And when they do, I think we should all learn from them. It's the reason why we call it a talent pool and not an ocean of talent, because few people kind of actually get this stuff and know how to use it. And it's worth watching and listening to. So I think that sometimes when we're planning and thinking, we do often think and overclaim about what we're going to do. This thing about moving 5% extra pallets would have made a huge difference to Weetabix in the days of selling pallets, rather than we're going to change your platforms or put you online, or, you know, sometimes just think back really hard about the kind of the state of what we're doing and changing. And so I'm a bit cynical also when we go, is everything wrong? Should we change everything? Because the answer, I think, is no. I think that we're already getting that thing. But there is we're heading into this zone where there's some brilliant illustrations. Google's one of them. It's fitting that we're in Google, because they're one of the people that have changed everything. So actually, although I'm quite cynical about everybody that says everything's changed, the truth is the last decade has changed things significantly. But some of the fundamentals ought not to be forgotten in terms of the way that we brief and think. 10 years ago, before starting kind of project work, if you like, I was working for GlaxoSmithKline. I was in the global marketing department. I just finished at Weetabix. And in truth, things seemed really stable and predictable and kind of easy, if I will. Trading was always difficult, and the numbers were always hard, and you always wanted to be number one if you weren't number one, and you always wanted to be number two if you weren't number two, unless you were number one. But the point is, it was kind of easy, it was predictable, it was kind of manageable. And the truth is, one of the reasons for that, and I've kind of gone back through my diary to see how this worked, but we used to be given this thing called the planning process. Do you remember that? Right? At Weetabix, we used to get, I'm not joking, for 3 months of the year, we used to be able to say to the factory people, we're in planning. And they used to go, oh, okay, really sorry about that. Don't come to the meeting, you're in planning. Not joking. We used to get 12 weeks. And at the end of the 12 weeks, we would end up sitting down with the managing director, the shareholders, and we would say, this is what we want to do. And we would do it collectively. There wouldn't be a client thing, it would be an agency thing. We'd had everything pretty much kind of, we had 12 weeks to do it. We had loads of time to do it. And the truth is, within that cycle, we were paid to think. And it kind of sounds like a fundamentally obvious thing, but all too often now that we're not. We were paid to think, we were paid to convert ideas, we were paid to have dreams that often you couldn't get close to, and have outlandish ideas when we were looking at SWOT analysis and say, why don't we do this? And people would go, that's a ridiculous thing to do. But sometimes people would go, why don't we do that? And the truth is, that's what I'm hearing a lot from the likes of Google right now. But the truth is, we were paid to dream, and we were paid to plan, and we were paid to be creative. And we would then sign off a plan. We would say, this is the plan for the next kind of year, sometimes 3 years. And we would off we would go. We would never have to go back and say, can we have some more money to do X, Y, Z? It was all within the margins of the P&L. and we would have the discipline and the authority to do it. We were paid to plan. And the truth is, I think that had a profound impact on me as a kind of the way that I look at things. But, and this is what I mean by things have changed too radically now, the problem now is that things have changed so much. And I honestly mean this, like, I'm not into this hyperbole about change, but things have changed so much that the truth is we've kind of been stopped. They've stopped asking us to plan, but they've not stopped asking us to do. And that's a problem, because planning is a fundamental and, for me, the heartbeat of the creative process. So if they're still asking us to do stuff, but in truth we're not getting time to think about how you do it and how you truly end up with something that's as good as something like Somerstown, which came from Mother, then I think we kind of might sometimes be failing. So in those meetings, we weren't sat updating our statuses, and we weren't tweeting, just had a great presentation with the chief exec of Weetabix, and we weren't worried about the perils and opportunities of 24/7 meetings, and there was no TVs in the corner with Sky News' constant reminders of what's not happened today. And trending meant, how are you doing in 52-week ending market share data? Right? That was trending, right? Oh, God, look at that full weekend. Don't worry about that. There's a huge promotion. We dropped the price to 99p. It's not real. Okay, fine. That was trending. The truth now, though, is the things have changed so dramatically that permanently, there's this brilliant guy in Australia I met, and the subject was, have communications become more important than marketing? And he said, of course we have. We stopped CEOs drowning. I mean, it's an interesting insight, right? That the comms teams are literally so worried now about where the board are at, where the reputation of the business is at, is that they think they're stopping people drowning. Well, if you're going to plan for 3 years, how do you do that in an environment where people think the waters are kind of that dangerous? So things have changed so much that I think, in truth, this might be one of those periods where we can think again. Things technologically are changing so much, and everything I've heard so far is kind of cementing my view that this is the time for us to have a think about this. So if the next decade is probably as full of as much change as the last decade, which was probably had more change in it than the previous century, so we've got another decade of complete madness and things being complete, then we have to adjust to that, right? By basic evolution, right? We have to adjust to that to do an outstanding job in the next decade in terms of the way that we're planning. Because in the last decade, the role of agencies has structurally changed. So I was at dinner with a brilliant CEO not long ago, and he said, look, 10 years ago, we'd have told them what it costs. If they'd have said no, we wouldn't have worked with them. He said, now we tell them what it costs, they say no, they tell us what they'll pay us, we work with them. I mean, it's true. No one can pretend that's not true. How many businesses nowadays walk away from a client because they don't think that they represent the values of that agency? Very few. 10 years ago, I hate to do the old man thing, but it used to be quite common. You know, that's where we want to be as an agency. These are our values. We're going to work with these people. So in other words, that kind of constant tug on the P&L is getting to all of us. So I think the opportunity for you, and I love planners, you've made me more nervous about speaking than any bloody speeches that I do about the Olympics, Paralympics, because you're all so bright and brilliant, and you're kind of thinking, I've already thought better than him. So, but you've got to realise that the boardrooms, I've been very lucky, in every job I've worked on, I've sat on the board, right? So it makes a structurally different outlook when you can sit around and see what the finance guys are thinking, not outside of the room, but in the room. And to have done that on the projects that I've done it on has been brilliant because it's taught me so much. But you've got to remember that the boards are not made up of planners, and they're not made up of strategists, and they're not made up of creatives. They're not made up, in other words, of people like us. So we have to find our role in there to make sure that works. There are, of course, some brilliant strategists on the boards, but just they understand advertising much more than they understand planning. And sometimes I think that is a kind of bit of a threat. So what is modern planning and how can it help modern clients? I think the thing and the word that has always worried me most is the word formula. I think formula is really bad. I hate the idea of formula. Too many agencies, I've been on a lot of agencies, I saw who was coming and I went on a lot of your websites, not going to name and shame. But if you go back to the way you extract blah, blah, blah out of clients, you're all pretty much using the same language. And I think you should think about this because the truth is genuinely brilliant creativity and that as an inspiration from the planning process kind of, I don't think, works that way. There is nothing creative about a 5-page creative template that I have to work with as a client. There's nothing creative about it. There's everything that locks me into a lot of outdated thinking. If you give me a 5-page creative brief that I have to work with and fill out every box, otherwise it won't go through the system. There is nothing to be gained out of having something so rigid in a world where actually the thing that we should be challenging is the conformity. There's nothing that's sensible about putting the Olympics and the Paralympics in the same brief, because they're two fundamentally different things and they're at two different points of their cycle. There's nothing to be gained from looking at different things in exactly the same way through this thing called the 5-page creative template. You all have one. And I think they're kind of one of the reasons why in some instances we might be losing a bit of traction. There's everything to be gained, though, by using your brains, your experience, your curiosity about building original processes for original problems. And in truth, they are mostly original problems, right? So by default, a 5-page briefing template suggests you treating the client's problem as an unoriginal problem, which in itself, I think, would be a flaw. There's the opportunity to do something genuinely different. So if you were to be given a brief for a general election, if someone came to you and said, run a general election, how do we do that? You definitely wouldn't turn to this template. If we gave you the brief to say, we found a cure for dementia, how do we communicate it? You wouldn't turn to that template. If we gave a brief out to say, who should be the ambassador for the games makers, it wouldn't have ended up with Eddie Izzard as the trainer of the games makers at the Olympic Games and Paralympic Games. And that's because in most instances, the formula in genuinely creative problems needs to be abandoned. We made a film called Somerstown with Mother and Shea Meadows. The system didn't come up with it. It came through a brilliant piece of original thinking that allowed us to prosper. We called them the games makers, not volunteers. It wasn't in the brief. It came through people saying to us, you've got to look at this differently. We saw homegrown stories on the torch relay when the conformity in the system said, do it the way it was always done. And we asked Channel 4 to broadcast the Paralympics, and they came up with a brilliant thing called The Last Leg, without a creative brief, just as a spark of brilliant creativity from a planner, from a planning team. So at no point in those instances, they're just tiny instances, there's loads more, but did we consult the formula? Because the system would have said no. So in terms of moving forward, I think the future of planning, it's the most amazing thing. It's the discipline. I always wanted to be bright enough to be a planner. And I still do want to be bright enough to be a planner. I love planners and I can kind of spend all my time listening to them. But in the future, I think for planners to kind of move even further and faster with the technology things that are changing, and to be in the room when real strategy is being discussed, not, by the way, the strategy of how you execute, because there's a difference between strategy and strategy for advertising, completely different things. What planners should want and what I would encourage you all to want and to ask to be in the room in is the points of genuine strategic discussion between boards and directors when they're making these decisions. The Games Maker brief, Nikki Crumpton and the Games Maker brief, brilliant brief, we gave that with 2 years to go, and it allowed them, McCann, to come up with this thing called Games Makers, which we'll kind of, it's now in the dictionary. Real strategy should be at the start of the process. So think originally and centrally about creating modern competitive briefing process. Plan to your strengths. Don't take this formula. Don't take this template. Plan to your own personal strengths. Plan with your boss's strengths. Plan a pitch with Google, right? Or a filmmaker, or a CEO of a charity, or a customer that refuses to buy your product. Plan a pitch and brief differently. Say no to clients that want a 5-page creative briefing, because in the long run, it's going to kind of lead you nowhere. And know, and find this stuff, that 36% of people at the moment say they're broke with a week to go before payday. That stuff's available if you dig deep enough on the YouGov tracking polls, right? Get into that stuff so that when you're walking into the room, 1 week to go, 36% of UK adults say that they're broke. And maybe ask yourselves what Nate Silver can teach us about aggregated polling techniques for brands rather than for elections. Because if you do that stuff, and if anyone wants to do that, by the way, come and talk to me. I'd love to do that. I don't know where it would take us, but it would be quite fun. Critically, though, the ultimate thing for you guys, I think, and for us all, I think, is to own mood and understand the contours of public opinion, where it will go, where it will shift, and where it will lead us for our brands. Because, by the way, every board member, every director of the board is completely shitting themselves at the moment about 10 years of austerity. What does it mean for their brand, their market? You can, we can, be the point that can help codify what's happening. So, in conclusion, I just say, fuck the formula. as you might have guessed. It's the best thing about Mad Men, by the way. There is no meetings with planners going, here's the 5-page planning template, because it didn't exist. Thank you.
Wow. Greg, stay on stage.